Good evening, Little Masters, and welcome to episode 375 of the Prancing Pony Podcast, where we learn that being an historian is a thankless job.
Right up there with podcaster.
Quite.
Folks, pull up a bench in the common room and join us. I'm James Tauber, the Sage of the South, and I'm here with the man of the West who once joined Rumal in a pub in Valinor, Alan Sisto.
He drank me under the table, James, I'm telling you. That guy, Rumil, man. Woo! All right, folks, join us as I hand the reins of the show over to my co-host, James, as he guides us through the story and works of the great Elven loremaster, Pengoloð.
No pressure, right?
None at all. None.
Folks, if you like this, it was all me. If you don't like it, Alan made me say it. I kid. Folks, no matter how you arrived, you're all welcome here in the common room. At the Prancing Pony Podcast, we're reading and talking our way through Middle-earth with plenty of speculation and bad jokes along the way.
Definitely. Now, we do love our deep dives into the lore. We enjoy discussing our favorite themes. And in today's episode, we enjoy taking deep dives into some of the fun corners of Middle-earth.
And we do try to keep it light and fun, like a couple of friends chatting at the pub. And we're glad you've joined us.
And I'm sure you'll be glad you joined as well. But before we get to tonight's chapter discussion, or I should say, it's not really a chapter that we're discussing, is it? Before we get to tonight's discussion about Pengoloð and the frame narrative and the histories and all of this stuff, it's time to catch up with James and the incredible work that he and his team have been doing over at the Digital Tolkien Project. Now, first off, folks, congratulations are in order. Now, I think we mentioned this in the mailbag last episode, but for those of you who didn't catch it or who are maybe joining us today for the first time, folks, Digital Tolkien Project won the 2025 Tolkien Society Award for Best Online Content, and it's well-deserved. It's long been in the works. I think it was your fourth nomination, and it's something that should have happened a while ago. So, James, before we get into the details of the Digital Tolkien Project, for those who maybe aren't familiar, can you give us a brief overview of exactly what it is?
Absolutely. So first of all, thank you for the congratulations.
Well deserved, sir.
Thank you. So as to the origins, if you look at how people engage with, say, biblical texts or things like the Iliad or the Odyssey, you see that for centuries there's been a wealth of material, commentaries, maps, glossaries, encyclopedias of the people and places, guides to the original languages, and so on. And Tolkien has always been remarkable as a 20th century author in that a lot of that sort of material exists for his work. He's quite unusual in the extent to which the sort of material about his world. But what we've seen over the last half century or so with the Bible or Homer is a wealth of digital tools, right? Digital reading environments backed by databases of information. And that's actually what I work on in my day job, working at projects such as the Perseus Digital Library, making things like the texts of Homer available in their original languages with translations and commentaries and all sorts of resources to help better understand the text. And I started wondering back in 2018, what if those digital approaches that were being used for the Bible and Homer and other texts like that, what if they were also adopted within Tolkien studies? And it's really that question that led to the Digital Tolkien Project. So what we're really trying to do at the Digital Tolkien Project is build resources, really building on the foundation of work that's been done for these other texts using similar sorts of approaches with linguistics and computers and so on to better understand Tolkien's texts and the world that Tolkien created.
Fascinating. I love that you're taking these long proven tools and methods that have been applied to, genuine real world historical texts. And you're using these to kind of shed light and bring all of the details up in Tolkien's work. Fantastic. I know that not all of our listeners will have been familiar with your project, but I know they're all going to benefit from it because scholars, researchers, and other writers are going to have better data to work with as they write more about Tolkien's work. So whether you're going to a moot and listening to a paper, somebody has probably used the Digital Tolkien Project to help research that. So folks will benefit from it, even if you really don't quite know what it is. Where are you now on the project? Like, what's the latest accomplishment and the next sort of near-term goal or goals?
Yeah, so one of the first things that we did, and we've done for most of certainly the books published in Tolkien's lifetime, is develop citation system, a logical citation system, so that you can refer to the texts not by page numbers which suffer from being restricted to a particular edition.
Yeah.
It's quite frustrating if Christopher Tolkien mentions something in Lord of the Rings in the history of Middle-earth, he'll do it by a page number in the second edition.
Yeah.
And if you don't own the second edition of Lord of the Rings, those page numbers are not necessarily particularly meaningful. So one of the things that we did is develop a more logical citation system, like you would be familiar with in the Bible with book, chapter, verse, and so on, where it doesn't matter what page number something's on, you can refer to a particular verse in the Bible. The same is true for paragraphs in The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings, The Silmarillion.
So it's by paragraph then? I mean, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I'm trying to, because in a text like the Bible, the chapters and verses are numerated, and
right,
we don't have that in Tolkien. So
exactly. So one of the things that that we did quite recently, there's a pair of sites that kind of help with this that we've built. One is Search Tolkien, and Search Tolkien lets you start typing in text that you might have in front of you and will tell you the citation number to use.
So it'll give you like book, chapter, and what, paragraph number then?
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
And then there's a parallel site to that that we launched fairly recently called Cite Tolkien, and that goes the other way around. What you do there is you give it a citation. So say somebody gives you a citation, LR 4.04.57, in other words, the 57th paragraph in the 4th chapter of Book 4.
Okay.
And you're wondering, what is that paragraph? Now, obviously, we can't show the whole text.
That's what I was about to ask, but yeah, you've already got that.
And so what we do at Cite Tolkien is actually just show you the first couple of words, or first 3 words, and the last word of the paragraph, as well as the initial words of the 5 paragraphs before and the 5 paragraphs after.
Okay, so it puts it in context for it. Yeah.
Exactly. But this is entirely foundational, because once you have a citation system like that, that's what enables you to start attaching other information about the text. Because we can't redistribute the text, we need a way of redistributing data and information about the text that refers into the text. And so one of the big accomplishments that we had in 2023 was going through the speech in The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings, and The Silmarillion, and identifying who the speaker is. So the first part of that is identifying that there is speech. And it goes a little beyond simply looking at what's in quotation marks, because one of the things you realize if you start to look into the text, things being in quotes doesn't necessarily mean they're direct speech. No. Tolkien will sometimes just put things in scare quotes, or they're a foreign term or something like that. But there are also things that are direct speech that are not in quotation marks, for example, particularly in the Bilbo's party at the start of Lord of the Rings.
Where you get the italics instead.
You get italics. But of course, italics doesn't always mean direct speech.
Definitely doesn't always mean speech.
So one of the first steps was to go through and identify what is actually the direct speech.
Yeah.
And once you do that alone, you can answer interesting questions like, are words used differently within speech versus not within speech? One of the things that I've talked about in the past is, when does Tolkien contract things like do not to don't? And does it happen more in speech?
When Sam's talking,
so on.
Is the answer, right?
Well, you bring up an interesting point, which is it's one thing to just know that it's done more in speech versus narrative. And in fact, it's never done in the Silmarillion at all, in speech or narration.
There's a Commander Data joke in there somewhere. So Commander Data tells the Silmarillion, but yeah.
Yes, exactly. It's used all the time in The Hobbit.
Yeah.
The Lord of the Rings is actually sort of 50-50 within speech as to whether it's contracted or not. And that, of course, raises the question, is that a function of who the speaker is?
Yeah.
But in order to answer those kinds of questions, you need to know who's speaking in each case. It's one thing to search for the word do not or the word don't, but that's not going to tell you who's actually doing the speaking.
No.
And so one of the things that we did back in 2023 was to go through all of the direct speech in The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings, and The Silmarillion and identify who the speaker is.
Oh, that's a project.
And I'll say a little bit more about how that was done. But the result of that is now that we have that additional annotation.
Yeah.
And so we can look at how different words are used by different speakers. And just on that question of the do not versus don't, it's actually really fascinating, because Tolkien was very careful, because he was so conscious of this, to give different characters a different way of speaking.
Yeah.
And so elves never ever contract do not to don't. Gondorians never ever contract do not to don't. The Rohirrim never contract do not to don't.
Huh.
Almost every Hobbit does.
Wow.
And in fact, most hobbits do it all the time. They do not say do not, they always say don't. Sam, for example, always says don't. And so does Bilbo, in fact. Where it gets really interesting, though, is in those characters that mix them.
Yeah.
And they do in various percentages. Frodo, Merry, and Pippin tend to contract, but they don't always.
Right.
Gandalf and Aragorn tend not to, but sometimes they do.
Mm-hmm.
And I think one of the things we haven't done yet that I'd like to do is not only bring in who the speaker is, but who they're talking to.
Because that context would...
Exactly. Especially you imagine somebody like Gandalf especially, but even Aragorn, that they're very conscious of who they're talking to and the manner in which
the hypothesis is that perhaps Gandalf would contract more if he's talking to the hobbits, less if he's talking to the elves, to Elrond or to Galadriel, for instance.
Exactly. And in fact, I did, as part of my master's research in 2023, did a study of more generally how different speakers change their style, and Gandalf definitely changes his speech from the early chapters as things progress.
Interesting.
The most fascinating one, though, that I found just on this do not to don't contraction was Saruman.
Ooh.
Saruman does not contract do not to don't, except in the last parts of Book 6. When he's humbled as a beggar on the road, then he starts saying don't instead of do not. Oh, that's
fascinating.
I just find that fascinating. But the main point here is that this is a research question that can be answered only because we've got this annotated data.
Exactly.
That's just one example of something that we did back in 2023.
Mm-hmm.
We've also been doing a lot of work in the last year or so relating to particularly Lord of the Rings, annotating at a paragraph by paragraph level what characters are in the scene, where they're located, and we're getting to what day and time. It's setting.
Wow. Okay.
Because I've done some visualizations before, and you've probably seen many people do this, where they'll show where a particular character is at a particular time or something like that, right? They'll show where the movements of the members of the Fellowship at different points, where they're located, and so on. But one of the things we're always trying to do at the Digital Tolkien Project is tie that to the text.
Yeah,
in a very precise way. And of course, this is where the citation system comes in as well, because we can address exactly a particular paragraph.
Right.
So how do we know that at this point in time, Aragorn was in this particular location and so on? But also it enables things like a study of what characters do we get the point of view of, right? If you have a hypothesis that we're always focusing on Frodo, in the parts where Frodo's in it at all, right? How do you actually measure that? Well, if we know for every single paragraph who's there in the scene, in the narrative mainline, not who's being talked about, but who's actually there.
Present in the moment, yeah.
Exactly, which is another thing you can't just search for, right? If you search for the word Frodo, you get a little bit of an idea that he's, occurring a lot more in Book 4 than Book 3.
True.
And so
but he is definitely mentioned in Book 3.
But he's mentioned in Book 3. So to go a step further and say, when is he actually present in the narrative mainline? Yeah. Well, that's one of the annotations that we're doing, paragraph by paragraph. Here's who's present, where are they located, and that's going to enable all sorts of fun things with maps as well.
Oh, yeah.
Being able to see not only that particular characters were in a particular location, but to then trace that back to the text and say, actually take me to the paragraph where these characters were at this location. Yeah, that's one of the major things that we're working on at the moment, and we'll continue to work on in the short term. One other thing I'll just mention that we're working on in a big way, what's called the Tolkien Glossary, which is launched in an early version last year, but we're actively working on it now. And this has to do with capturing information about each word that appears in the text. Okay. So often there are questions. Again, this always comes back to what are the research questions that we want to be able to answer, and then what data do we need to be able to answer those questions. So any kind of study of how the language is used, what types of words are used, and so on, requires you to have some information about those words. If you're interested in when different speakers contract words, you need to know, well, what are the contractions?
Right.
You may be interested in questions like, is there a preponderance of Germanic words in certain parts of the text as opposed to Latinate words.
To Latin, right.
There may be things like when are color terms used? When are terms referring to celestial and astronomical objects used? All those sorts of things. All of those questions require you to know, well, what are the color terms?
Right.
What are the Latinate words? What are the astronomical terms? And so on. What are the adjectives, if you're interested in what adjectives are used in particular situations and so on. And so what the Tolkien glossary is trying to do is go through every single word that occurs. So it's about 19,000 distinct words occur across the Lord of the Rings, the Hobbit, and the Silmarillion.
Okay.
And we're tagging them for mostly their linguistic properties. Another aspect of that is which words are invented language words, which words are Sindarin words, which words are Quenya, which are Old English, and so on. And already having done that, we can start to do things like visualize where Tolkien is using his invented languages in the text. Do they occur more in one place than another? So that hopefully gives you a sense of the kinds of things that we're doing. It's a lot of work, but what we're really trying to do is just slowly and surely building up this information, this data, that can be then used in the service of answering interesting questions that people have about Tolkien.
And even in some ways generating interesting questions, because as you're talking through this, my brain keeps jumping to, well, what about this? And what about that? And
what I would love people to do is when they have interesting questions, to make sure they let me know, because that drives a lot of not only what we do, but the priority that we give to doing different things.
That makes sense. Yeah. You mentioned the different voices in the way people speak. I know that for me, thinking about the Council of Elrond is like the chapter that demonstrates, with clarity, the very different ways that characters speak from different cultures.
Yes.
Boromir has a very distinct way of speaking in comparison to the others. Glóin has a way of speaking that's different than the others. And part of me, though, and I don't know that we have the time to go in this rabbit hole, but I am fascinated to know, because there are already something like 23 individual speakers in the council, or I think that might be the total number of people quoted, but there's fewer speakers. The point is that Gandalf himself quotes like 8 or 9 characters.
Right.
So how do you do nested stuff like that?
So when we were doing the speaker identification, we did model that.
Okay.
And I haven't looked into this yet, but one of the things that fascinates me about that is, do characters speak differently when we're just getting their speech retold by someone else? So in other words, does Saruman sound different when Gandalf is quoting him as opposed to what he sounds like when we actually directly get what he says?
Yeah.
We have the data to explore that. That's not a question that I have looked into. But when we were doing the speaker identification, we did model who's the actual speaker and also who are they quoting?
Who's the person who's quoting the speak. Okay. Because because Isildur is the one who speaks even the most differently, because he's speaking very, very antiquated mode of speech, as he's talking about hot as a gleed and all that.
Yes.
It feels like Gandalf is reading an ancient script. I mean, and he really is in terms of thousands of years previous. And I just thought, that's an interesting question. Like, how does your data address that? But it sounds like you're several steps ahead, as I would imagine you would be. Fascinating stuff. You mentioned we a few times. I know that this project began a little smaller than that. I don't know if it was ever just you, but I know that you've grown a rather large team around the project now. Can you tell me how this has impacted your ability to not only accomplish the work, but maybe expand your goals or come up with new ideas that would have been impossible or impractical to achieve when it was a smaller team or when it was just you?
Yeah, so it did start off as just me, and in fact, it wasn't even entirely conceived of in the form that it's now grown into from the beginning. So back when I had this idea of what if you treated Tolkien the way that you treat the biblical texts and Homer and stuff like that, I was originally just thinking of it as a blog about this topic.
Oh wow!
I was just going to blog about ideas, bringing in from digital classics and biblical studies and so on, and applying them to Tolkien just in blog form. I very quickly came across a few classicists that I worked with. Interestingly, both Italian, because there's the Venn diagram of classicists who are interested in Tolkien has a big intersection among Italians. So Italian classics, Tolkien. And so I had some initial collaborators that I was discussing ideas with. And a lot of the initial ideas about a citation system and also named entities, which is something I didn't mention, which is going through and marking up in the text anytime you come across a name, a place, a person, an object, and stuff like that, and cataloging them. And that ties in with the Tolkien glossary. So I had some initial discussions, and we had this little Slack workspace that we chatted on, and we did, a couple of us started doing some annotations. But where things really started to take off was when we switched to using Discord. And I think the big difference there was with Slack, I was having to pay per user.
Per user, yeah.
And so it was a very closed group. I didn't want to just open it up to just anyone, because I was going to have to pay money for every single person.
There's another $8 a month.
It's why Discord's model is much more appropriate for this, because of course individual users can pay Discord if they want to for various, add-ons for Nitro and stuff like that. But it's not the person running the server that necessarily has to take on the burden of that cost. And so we started the Discord for the Digital Tolkien Project, and it's now got about 300 people on it, most of whom aren't actively involved.
Right.
But it's really, I like working. There's this great term I've come across, which is working with the garage door open. And it's this idea that as you work on your project, people can come by and see what you're doing.
I like that.
And I really like that with the Digital Tolkien Project, that people can just watch. They can just lurk. They don't have to get involved. But what started to happen more and more, starting back in 2023 with the Speaker Identification Project, is we had a handful of people with varying degrees of how much they did. There were 2 or 3 people that really went hardcore and really helped out in an amazing way to do that speaker identification. There are a couple of others that just did 1 or 2 chapters and so on, which was wonderful. So I think in total, we maybe ended up having about 9 people that helped with that speaker identification. And now with the work that we're doing, going through every single paragraph in Lord of the Rings and identifying the characters. And in fact, we're not just identifying the characters and the locations and the time, but also we're answering certain questions about the narrative, like, is this real-time action, or is it giving a summary? Is there travel in this scene? Is this scene identifying the location or the time of day and all that sort of information? And we have, again, this core group of people that have just been amazing in contributing to that. And this is something that, it's probably going to take, maybe another year to do.
Yeah. But the more people, the less it takes.
Exactly. And the same with the glossary. If people have a particular interest in tagging words, particularly if they have an interest in a particular field. So, I've got an astronomer doing the astronomy and
of course,
celestial terminology. I've got a botanist doing plant terms and so on like that. So there's all sorts of ways that people can contribute. Just in terms of that. And of course, the goal is for all of the data that we produce to be freely available. While the texts themselves, we obviously don't have the rights to.
Correct.
We do want to share the data publicly. And there's a lot where we're now sort of setting up. This is one of the goals for the near term, is to publish that data to make it available, as well as to build web applications and stuff that make it more accessible for people to, whether it's Tolkien scholars or fans, right? Because of course it's always been such a blurry line within the Tolkien world. I
think that's the thing about the Tolkien fandom.
Exactly.
Yes. I've had people talk about me as a scholar, and I'm like, I'm not a scholar, I'm a fan, but I study. And I write things. So I guess, does that make me a scholar? I don't know. I'm not pursuing a master's or a doctorate, so I don't feel like it does. But it is certainly, I think, the case that a lot of fans become sort of amateur scholars, if nothing else.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And it's hard to imagine being a scholar and not being a fan. So,
right.
Well, we're definitely running out of time, but I want to get your sort of grand vision. Where do you see the Digital Tolkien Project in, say, 5 years and 10 years? You talk about publishing the data, so maybe that's one medium-term, long-term goal.
Yeah, that's a big part of it, and just continuing to do this annotation. So there's still, the vision that I have for the Tolkien glossary and for the annotations that we're doing, paragraph level annotations, that's going to take a long time.
Yeah.
The Silmarillion raises a whole bunch of additional questions with regard to some of that paragraph level annotation, because it's such an unconventional narrative.
Yeah.
So much of the conventions that we've adopted for annotating Lord of the Rings only make sense when it's a clear, this happened and this person entered the room and said this, and the Silmarillion's just not structured like that for the most part. Some parts of it are, but when it's giving vast sweeping descriptions of things, and of course, of Beleriand and its realms being a great example,
comes to mind,
which is such a people knock it, but it's such a wonderful example of the kind of text that makes sense for us to annotate and do interesting things with.
100% it does, yeah.
But it doesn't necessarily fit with a lot of the kind of annotations that we've done in the past. So there's a lot of work still to do there. One of the big tasks that's probably the rest of my life is just has to do with unpacking the history of Middle-earth.
Oh.
And not only coming up with citation systems for that, but really provide ways of enabling people to engage with, because the thing about the history of Middle-earth is it's not just a work in its own right, but it's a container for a bunch of other texts that have relationships with one another. And the physical structure of the history of Middle-earth volumes is just one way that information can be presented. And it's somewhat limiting in a print book. And there are multiple times, I talked about this at the Christopher Tolkien Centenary Conference. Christopher multiple times says that there are all sorts of ways he could have approached this, but it's basically he had the limitations of the book and so on. There was no real way of presenting this. And I really, at the end of the day, one of my long-term visions is to say there are ways of presenting it that I hope Christopher would have been excited about.
Oh, wow.
Because there's just a complexity to it, and the different versions of text and the ability to sort of side by side compare texts and all that sort of stuff that's only possible in kind of digital reading environments as opposed to print books. So that's where I'd eventually like to get. I mean, one of my dreams is to come to an agreement with HarperCollins and the estate to enable an interactive online reading environment that actually does let you see the text.
Yeah.
Obviously, it's still under copyright, so it would not be something that would be freely available. But there are ways of dealing with that.
Well, sure, a subscription-based thing where they get some of the revenue, and
exactly. I almost think of it. One way I sort of think about it is if you look at something like the Folio Society, and the way that they make these bespoke books that other publishers they're published already, but they do it in a different. They retypeset them and they recopy edit them, and they have wonderful cover design and so on. They put all this tremendous effort into it for people that really care about that stuff. Well, imagine that sort of digitally versus Kindle, right? Sure, you can buy the Kindle version. Sure. But what if you could instead get a much richer, carefully crafted online reading experience that brought in all this extra annotation and linking between the text and that kind of stuff?
That'd be great.
That's my long-term,
that's a dream.
Sometime in my lifetime.
We can all hope. Well, James, thank you for bringing us through all of this. I am just so excited for all that you've been able to do with the Digital Tolkien Project, but even more so for the things that are coming. So really, really excited. Folks, one last thing. Tell folks where they can find you.
Yeah, so the best thing to do is go to digitaltolkien.com.
There you go.
But, we're Digital Tolkien on a bunch of social media platforms as well. There's a YouTube channel, but all of that's linked from digitaltolkien.com, as well as things like that I mentioned, like the glossary and
and then the Discord as well as something.
And the Discord, all linked from digitaltolkien.com.
All right. Well, let's go ahead and get into today's discussion. It's going to be an interesting one. After handing the reins off to James, the decision was that we're going to take an entire episode looking at the lore master Pengoloð. And James, why don't I have you go ahead and start out, kind of give us some background about who this guy is.
Would love to. In this episode, we're going to look at two accounts of conversations Pengoloð had with everyone's second favorite mariner, Ælfwine. Sorry, Eldarin.
So Eldarin is the third greatest.
I think a distant third.
So he is to Feanor and Rumil what, or to Ælfwine and
I don't know where are you putting Feanor in this? Is he first or last? Yeah.
Okay.
Anyway, the two accounts that we're going to look at form part 3 of the Peoples of Middle-earth, Teachings of Pengoloð.
All right. Now, in the Book of Lost Tales, the frame narrative is the elves on the Lonely Isle telling stories to Eiriol. And later, Eiriol becomes the name that the elves give to Ælfwine. But in the 1930s, that frame narrative changes. Ælfwine becomes the translator of works that were supposedly written by a Pengoloð, the Wise of Gondolin. And folks, I just want to note that it's the D, Pengoloð, not the voiced TH sound like you'll so often hear us say with Pengoloð. Now, that frame narrative includes the Ainulindale, the Pennas, or Quenta Silmarillion, the Annals of Valinor, the Annals of Beleriand, and the Account of Tongues, or the lembas. And Pengoloð is said in turn to have derived certain material from the writings of Rumil, the elf sage of Valinor.
In particular, the parts of the annals taking place in Valinor were written by Rumil, but the parts in Beleriand were written by Pengoloð. Even in the annals of Valinor, though, in any time there's mention made of what was going on with Thingol et al. In Beleriand, it's annotated with "Thus saith Pengoloð" or "Quoth Pengoloð."
Quoth Pengoloð. I think we have the name of our episode title. Quoth Pengoloð.
I definitely think it should be. Yes. Tolkien refers to these in the Annals of Valinor as the Beleriandic Interpolations. A great name for a band.
The Beleriandic Interpolations. Only you, James, would think that's a great band name, but all right.
There's even a point where Pengoloð adds, "This have I, Pengoloð, added here, for it was not known unto Rumil."
The supposedly superior historian. I just want to make sure folks all know I know something Rumil didn't know.
Like, I can imagine. We now cross to our Beleriand correspondent, Pengoloð, with the latest news from Middle-earth.
Well, Rumil, I'm coming to you from the depths of the forest of Brethil, and you would not believe what we're able to find here. Elfwine, in one document, writes, "These histories were written by Pengoloð the Wise of Gondolin, both in that city before its fall and afterwards at Tathrobel in the Lonely Isle, Toloressia." This is also back when some of these names were a little different. In this case, it's Toloressia, one word, as opposed to what we're all used to seeing.
And Tathrobel rather than Tavrobel.
It's Tathrobel, not Tathrobel. Oh, yeah, you're right.
I mean, I don't know whether it was voiced or not, but normally it's a V rather than a TH.
Oh, you're right. Yeah, okay. And this, of course, be after the return unto the west, is what Elfwine writes. He continues, "In their making, he used much the writings of Rumil, the elf sage of Valinor, chiefly in the Annals of Valinor and the Account of Tongues. And he used also the accounts that are preserved in the Golden Book. The work of Pengoloð I learned much by heart, and turned into my tongue, some during my sojourn in the West, but most after my return to Britain." Because, of course, that was the frame narrative that Elfwine was part of. So when Tolkien was first trying to get this Silmarillion material published, and remember, he was trying to get this published back when he wanted The Lord of the Rings published, so this is a long time coming, he conceived of the work as consisting of the Quentus Silmarillion proper, the two annals, and the Lammas. In other words, the Silmarillion was intended to pretty much just be the works of Pengoloð translated by Elfwine.
Now, post Lord of the Rings, things shifted to Elfwine not just translating the works of Pengoloð, but hearing stories directly from, as Tolkien started to call him, Pengoloð.
Okay, so that's when you get the voiced.
Exactly, yeah. And there are various accounts of Pengoloð and Elfwine discussing things. In one discussion on the origin of orcs, it's Pengoloð who argues that Melkor could not actually make anything that had life.
Right.
He could only corrupt that which was already living. So that idea is actually from Pengoloð.
Oh, that's interesting. Because, I mean, that's certainly something that we all accept as, like a hard, firm part of the canon. Melkor can do a lot, but he can't do that.
Yeah. So this is actually an argument that Pengoloð makes from his own reasoning.
Yeah, from his own knowledge of history and his own,
But it's in another discussion between Pengoloð and Elfwine that we're going to focus on in particular in this episode.
Okay.
Before we get to that, though, we do have a bit of biographical information that we get in the War of the Jewels.
That's right. Now, in the work Quendi and Eldar, subtitled Origin and Meanings of the Elvish Words referring to elves and their varieties, with appendices on their names for other incarnates. What a subtitle that is.
It's such an 18th century title. Yeah.
It really is. It's more of a summary than a subtitle, really.
Yes.
Let me sum up. No, you have more room than that. Let me explain. All right. So in that work, we get the following. Though Feanor, after the days of his first youth, took no more active part in linguistic lore and enquiry, he is credited by tradition with the foundation of a school of Lambengolmor, or loremasters of tongues, to carry on this work. This continued in existence among the Noldor, and he's using the early version of that, which is more like Noldor, right? It's like the Ngoldor, even through the rigors and disasters of the flight from Aman and the wars in Beleriand, and it survived indeed to return to Eressëa. Of the school, the most eminent member after the founder was, or still is, Pengoloð, an elf of mixed Sindarin and Noldoran ancestry, born in Nevrast, who lived in Gondolin from its foundation. He wrote both in Sindarin and in Quenya. He was one of the survivors of the destruction of Gondolin, from which he rescued a few ancient writings, and some of his own copies, compilations, and commentaries. It is due to this, and to his prodigious memory, that much of the knowledge of the elder days was preserved. All that has here been said concerning the elvish names and their origins, and concerning the views of the older loremasters, is derived directly or indirectly from Pengoloð. For before the overthrow of Morgoth and the ruin of Beleriand, he collected much material among the survivors of the wars at Sirion's mouth concerning languages and gesture systems with which, owing to the isolation of Gondolin, he had not before had any direct acquaintance. Pengoloð is said to have remained in Middle-earth until far on into the Second Age for the furtherance of his enquiries, and for a while to have dwelt among the dwarves of Khazad-dûm. Khazad-dûm. But when the shadow of Sauron fell upon Eriador, he left Middle-earth, the last of the Lembas, and sailed to Eressëa, where maybe he still abides. Wow! That's a blurb. There's an about the author page you don't normally read.
Exactly, and it's fascinating to think that he was there in the Second Age.
I know.
Spent time in Khazad-dûm and everything.
Yeah. All the way until Sauron's shadow falls on Eriador.
Yeah.
He's around for a long time.
Yeah. And he's a big deal.
Yeah,
right? I mean, he's a huge deal.
I mean, he's the connection. He's the connection between...
For everything.
Yeah, he really is.
Everything in the published Silmarillion in some way came through him, in at least in Tolkien's original conception.
But I mean, even in universe, he connects Valinor and Middle-earth in a way that nobody else does, because certainly Feanor and Rúmil had nothing to do with Middle-earth. So he carries those traditions over with him. Now, yeah, he's isolated in Gondolin for a while, and so he has to...
He makes up for it, though.
Yeah, exactly. Learn a little bit about the languages. But wow.
Yeah.
Fascinating.
Yeah, it's remarkable. Which again raises the question, why is there no mention of him in The Lord of the Rings or the Silmarillion even, right? He doesn't even get a mention in the Silmarillion. Yeah, even though, as we've said, he was crucial to the transmission of the history. He seems to get erased altogether. Yeah. Now, we will talk at the end of the episode about why that may have been.
Good.
And some of Tolkien's changes in ideas that may have led to that.
Okay.
But let's first of all get to the first of the teachings of Pengoloð in the Peoples of Middle-earth, the Dungweth Pengoloð.
Now, soon we'll get back to the answer of Pengoloð, but before we do, we want to remind you there's a lot more talk going on at the Prancing Pony podcast than just us.
The PPP has an amazing listener community. They're always coming up with great questions and discussions across all our social media spaces. Check out our common room on Facebook, our dedicated subreddit, Twitter, and more.
Now, on Facebook, just look for the Prancing Pony podcast. Follow the page to get the news, but you're going to want to join the group to get involved in some great discussions.
On Twitter, Instagram, Blue Sky, Twitch, TikTok, and YouTube, we're at Prancing Pony Pod. Or if you prefer Reddit, find us there at r/Prancing Pony Pod.
And if you want daily Tolkien content, check out Today's Tolkien Times on the PPP YouTube channel and on all your favorite podcast apps. That's my short format daily show with everything from Middle-earth Map Monday to Word Nerd Wednesdays. And there's my new twice weekly streaming of all fun things Middle-earth on the PPP Plays. Be sure to check both of those out on the YouTube channel for all the PPP productions at youtube.com/@prancingponypod.
Okay, let's get back to the Dungweth Pengoloð.
All right. Well, that Dungweth Pengoloð, or answer of Pengoloð, exists in two manuscripts. And the first, Christopher tells us, is a really good clear text. But the second, it is a beautiful illuminated manuscript. And if you've got a hardcover copy of The Peoples of Middle-earth, it is produced there as the frontispiece in full color, and it is stunning. Christopher points out that it was a work of importance to my father is evident from his writing it again in a manuscript of such elegance. Now, here's the interesting thing. The illuminated manuscript, along with the text of lembas, which we'll talk about later, was enclosed in a newspaper from January 5th, 1960, on which Tolkien wrote two items from the lore of Pengoloð. Danbeth to question, why did Elvish language change?
Now, the Danbeth on the newspaper, but Dangweth in the manuscript is quite appropriate given the topic of language change.
Yeah, it is.
Tolkien considered both, but decided on the word for answer, Dangweth, with a root gweth, meaning report, give an account of, inform of things unknown or wished to be known, rather than the mere beth, meaning word.
Fair enough. Be more specific, right? Yeah.
Christopher suggests that the Dangweth Pengoloð cannot be earlier than 1951, while from the date of the newspaper, it cannot be later than the end of 1959. He says, I would be inclined to place it earlier rather than later in the decade.
Now, that's interesting. I'm curious, do you know why he could date it all the way back to 1951?
He does not seem to give a reason for why he thinks it should be earlier in the decade. He doesn't give a reason.
Okay, yeah. It's not to say there isn't one. He obviously had one. It just didn't feel like it was necessary to explain it.
I mean, normally he dates things like that based on choice of spelling of names or relevance to the topics at hand, but he doesn't elaborate in this case.
No. Okay. Well, let's go ahead and look at the Dangweth Pengoloð itself, not just sort of like how it came about or, what it is. Look at it itself. The work itself is Pengolod's answer to the question, if elves live for such a long time, why would there even be language change? And that's really a good question. We know groups of elves were separated from one another, right? Whether we're talking about the Teleri from the Vanyar and Noldor, the Sindar and the Nandor that then break off from the Teleri that continued on to Aman. What about the Noldor who went back to Middle-earth versus those that stayed in Valinor? Given their long life, and by long I mean the life of Arda, is that enough to explain the differences between the different elvish languages? So, James, tell us what Pengoloð himself says. Begin reading for us, if you would.
Be glad to. Dangweth Pengoloð. The answer of Pengoloð to Alfwine, who asked him, how came it that the tongues of the elves changed and were sundered? Now you question me, Alfwine, concerning the tongues of the elves, saying that you wonder much to discover that they are many, akin indeed, yet unalike. For seeing that they die not, and their memories reach back into ages long past, you understand not why all the race of the Quendi have not maintained the language that they had of old, in common, still one and the same in all their kindreds. But behold, Alfwine, within Ea all things change, even the Valar.
Ooh.
So Pengoloð talks about a view of things that takes in all of space and time. All things change because they exist in space and in time. He goes on to talk about how a book, once read, is a single completed thing, but one part of it is not the same as another.
Ooh, okay. Interesting analogy. I like that.
Yeah. Well, it gets even better. He gives two other examples, the River Sirion and the Valar Manwe. And I think these analogies are both beautiful philosophically and literarily. Okay. This is one of my favorite things of Tolkien.
All right.
So Pengoloð says, from the spring in the mountains to the mouths of the sea, all is Sirion. And from its first updwelling even to its passing away when the land was broken in the great battle, that also is Sirion and nothing less. Though we, who are set to behold the great history, reading line by line, may speak of the river changing as it flows and grows broad, or dying as it is spilled or devoured by the sea. Yea, even from his first coming into Ea from the side of Ilúvatar, and from the young lord of the Valar in the white wrath of his battle with Melkor, unto the silent king of years uncounted, that sits upon the vanished heights of Oelosse, and watches but speaks no more. All that is he whom we call Manwe. It's beautiful writing, but it also has a fascinating point.
Truth, doesn't it? Yeah.
Right. It's always the Sirion. It's always Manwe, but both change.
Not only do they change, but they are different things even at the same time. I mean, I'm thinking particularly Sirion, right? I mean, like you said, the space and time. I mean, the Manwe example is sort of a time example, but the Sirion example is a space and time example.
And time. He says both, because he says from the spring of the mountains to the mouth of the sea.
Yeah.
And then gives the time dimension of it. Yeah.
And it's fascinating. And he's he makes a good point, because I have to admit, this is a question that I'd asked long before I'd read the history of Middle Earth. It's like, okay, elves live forever. So why would the language change so much? I mean, I remember what I spoke 10,000 years ago. Why wouldn't I still speak the same language?
And this is exactly what he's going to address.
This is what he's getting at. And then also, in hindsight, really, do I speak the same language that I spoke even 30 years ago?
Well, Pengoloð is going to get...
Arguably, I don't, right? I mean, I grew up in Southern California in the 80s. I certainly do not speak like I did when it was the 80s.
And this is going to be Pengoloð's suggestion too. Yeah.
I think this is going to be really interesting. So he does give another example about trees, and then he moves on to the elves, and this is beautiful too. Immortal within Ea are the Eldar, but since even as men they dwell in forms that come of Ea, they are no more changeless than the great trees, neither in the forms that they inhabit, nor in the things that they desire or achieve by means of those forms. Wherefore should they not then change in speech, of which one part is made with tongues and received by ears? So we get this enumeration of things that change in elves, right? The forms they inhabit, their desires, their achievements. That makes sense. We all change over time, both in our physical bodies as well as what we want, what we've been able to accomplish. Yep. So why wouldn't their speech change as well? And then Pengoloð continues, weak indeed may be the memories of men, but I say to you, Elfwine, that even were your memory of your own being as clear as that of the wisest of the Eldar, still within the short span of your life, your speech would change. And were you to live on with the life of the elves, it would change more, until looking back, you would perceive that in your youth, you spake an alien tongue.
It's exactly what you just said about yourself.
Totally tubular, man.
Did you really speak like that?
No, I did not actually. I'm very proud to say I did not completely get into surfer/valley speak in the 80s. But I mean, that's the point. We do use different words. We also use the same words in different meanings, even over the course of a normal human lifespan. So sure. This whole point, this sets up a point of contention among the lore masters, right? I mean, some of them would say the languages of men change because the memories of men are poor. Oh, those stupid, lame men. Of course, their languages change. They're inferior. But Pengoloð thinks they would change even if their memories were as good as the elves. And he adds this, for men change both their old words for new and their former manner of speaking for another manner in their own lifetimes, and not only in the first learning of speech. And this change comes above all from the very changefulness of Ea, or if you will, from the nature of speech, which is fully living only when it is born. But when the union of the thought and the sound is fallen into old custom, and the two are no longer perceived apart, then already the word is dying and joyless, the sound awaiting some new thought, and the thought eager for some new patterned raiment of sound. Wow, mind-blowing.
Yeah. So he starts off saying, in other words, language has to change because the world changes.
Yeah.
Our lives change, as you said. But there's so much I love about this passage. Firstly, there's this idea that when a word is fossilized in meaning, it becomes dead and joyless.
Yeah.
But then he introduces this idea of sounds being separate from thought, and the thought always looking for a sound to dress itself in.
I love that. What a picture that is.
Exactly. It's almost as if Pengoloð is saying words are thoughts with clothes on.
Ooh.
I love it.
I like that.
And it ties beautifully with Tolkien's aesthetic appreciation of words.
I was thinking that exact thing. I mean, that's so Tolkienian right there.
Yeah. So for sound's association with a particular meaning becomes joyless, it should cast off the old meaning and adorn a new one. It's it's a gorgeous analogy.
And because it all stems from the fact that we don't live in a static universe. Ea itself is changeful. That is, change is part of the very nature of our entire universe.
Yep.
So it's going to be reflected in linguistic change too.
Yep, absolutely.
Oh, man.
And then we get a new analogy, which is going to set up a difference between elves and men. Pengoloð tells us that elves differ from men in that they're ever more aware of the words that they speak. As a silversmith may remain more aware than others of the tools and vessels that he uses daily at his table, or a weaver of the texture of his garments. Yet this makes rather for change among the Eldar than for steadfastness. For the Eldar, being skilled and eager in art, will readily make things new, both for delight to look on, or to hear, or to feel, or for daily use, be it in vessels, or raiment, or in speech. And I also love this because it goes against any notion that somehow Tolkien was a curmudgeon and completely conservative in things. He's saying, no, the artisan delights in the new.
Yeah.
They're more aware of their materials, but this doesn't make them resistant to change, but gives them an additional eagerness for change.
Yeah, it does.
They want new things to look at, to hear, to feel. And this is extra true of the elves because they are even more aware of the words they speak. They're artisans of the word. And so they love this idea of what new things they can do.
And artisans of the word, does that not describe Tolkien himself?
Exactly. And I think
that's...
we're going to see more signs of, I think, some autobiographical
I was going to say, I'm starting
here.
to sense some Tolkien in Pengoloð here. So next, Pengoloð gives one way, though, in which speech is different from other crafts. So right now we've got the difference between elves and men that you just looked at. Now we're looking at the way speech itself differs from, let's say, silversmithing or what a garment maker might do. A man may indeed change his spoon or his cup at his will, and need ask none to advise him or to follow his choice. It is other indeed with words, or the modes and devices of speech. Let him bethink him of a new word, be it to his heart howsoever fresh and fair. It will avail him little in converse, until other men are of like mind, or will receive his invention. We can make up a new word. Let's say, like we've taken the acronym.
It's a great word. You just made up a word.
Just made up a word.
And I like it. So we're good.
I do too. But that's only nobody else does. We've taken that acronym of shall prove it by an instrument, made it spabimi, which is sort of a word, right? I mean, it's spelled SPUHBM. I don't know how it's spelled. Spabimi. But it's got a very limited audience, right? A few thousand people know what it means in the entire world. So it will avail you little in converse.
Right.
That's a great point. I mean, look, I can drink out of a 70-ounce mug if I want to be really weird, and nobody's going to care. People might look at me funny, but it's not going to change anything. But if I start coming up with funky words that nobody else wants to use, they're not going to mean anything.
It's useless. Yeah,
that's right.
Exactly.
So crafting a new word requires others to receive it and to be willing to receive it. So language really differs in that way. And Pengoloð continues, but among the Eldar, there are many quick ears and subtle minds to hear and appraise such inventions. And though many be the patterns and devices so made that prove in the end only pleasing to a few or to one alone, many others are welcomed and pass swiftly from mouth to mouth with laughter or delight or with solemn thought, as maybe a new jest or newfound saying of wisdom will pass among men of brighter wit. For to the Eldar, the making of speech is the oldest of the arts and the most beloved. And boy, there's another autobiographical point about Tolkien right there. Huh? Now I'm put in mind of Mythopoeia and how like stars weren't stars until we called them that, basically, and how it is the oldest of the arts. So, the Eldar, of course, are more receptive to the crafting of new words and devices of speech. And the ancientry of the craft of being a speech maker, of coming up with words. Fascinating. Absolutely fascinating.
You can see why I love this so much as a linguist.
Totally. I see why you're like, let me do one on Pengoloð. Okay,
exactly. This is
say so.
This is my manifesto, or Tolkien's really in many respects. There you go. I said Tolkien continues
or
Pengoloð continues. Yes. The Eldar would alter the sounds of their speech at whiles to other sounds that seemed to them more pleasant, or were at the least unstaled. But this they would not do at haphazard, for the Eldar know their tongue, not word by word only, but as a whole. They know even as they speak, not only of what sounds is that word woven which they are uttering, but of what sounds and sound patterns is their whole speech at one time composed. I'll say more about that in a moment. But
I hope so.
There's a footnote in the manuscript itself And these are for the most part few in number, for the Eldar being skilled in craft and not wasteful, nor prodigal to small purpose, admiring in a tongue rather the skilled and harmonious use of a few well-balanced sounds than profusion ill-ordered.
That makes sense. I mean, that's very, very elvish right there. You know?
I want you to remember this, though, because I think he's setting up criticism in the primary world of other people's invented languages.
Of course he is.
I think that's where he's going.
Of course he is.
The main text continues, though. Therefore, none among the Eldar would change the sounds of some one word alone, but would rather change some one sound throughout the structure of his speech. Nor would he bring into one word only some sound or union of sounds that had not before been present, but would replace some former sound by the new sound in all words that contained it. Or if not in all, then in a number selected according to their shapes and other elements, as he's guided by some new pattern that he has in mind. Even a weaver might change a thread from red to blue, either throughout his web or in such parts thereof as were suitable to the new pattern, but not randomly here and there, nor only in one corner.
Okay.
Again, remember that, because I'm going to say more about that in the primary world context. Christopher then brings up, though, a note that his father had made on the Shibboleth of Feanor, where he wrote, "The Eldar had an instinctive grasp of the structure and sound system of their speech as a whole, and this was increased by instruction. For in a sense, all Eldarin languages were invented languages, art forms, not only inherited, but also material engaging the active interest of their users and challenging awarely their own taste and inventiveness."
I really like that. That's so interesting because, of course, let's just be honest, outside of the universe, all Eldarin languages are indeed invented languages. So cool to tie that in and make them invented languages even in universe.
Exactly. So there's a few things to unpack here. One is this whole idea of a sound system, right? Rather than just individual random words changing, right? He talks about this whole idea of, no, the sound's got to change systematically throughout the language. So this whole idea of a sound system rather than just individual sounds is
right.
core to modern linguistics, but it was also core among the neo-grammarian school, which was the late 19th century philological tradition that Tolkien himself studied under Joseph Wright.
Okay.
The mantra of the neo-grammarians was that sound laws don't have exceptions. Every sound change can be explained.
Okay.
And one of the shining achievements of that sort of led to this is something that the people may have heard, Grimm's Law. Basically, it was noticed in the early 19th century that anytime you had a P in Latin, you had an F in or a F sound in the Germanic languages. So a classic example of that is the Latin pater versus the German Vater, our father.
Right.
And a Danish linguist, Rasmus Rask, realized that there were actually a whole series of changes like that were quite systematic. And again, it's not just that one word changed. It's that all the instances of P changed to F.
Interesting.
And all the B's became P's and the D's became T's and G's became K's and so on. There was this very consistent shift from Proto-Indo-European to Proto-Germanic, and you see it in all the Germanic languages as opposed to the other Indo-European languages.
Right.
And this was popularized by Jakob Grimm, which is why it's known as Grimm's Law, even though it was really Rasmus Rask that formulated it. But there was a problem, which was it didn't always work. There were some words that it didn't seem to apply. Another Danish linguist, Carl Werner, came along at the end of the 19th century, or towards the end of the 19th century, and realized that those seeming exceptions could be explained once you took into account where the stress was in the word.
Okay.
And if you merely had a rule that said when the stress is there, it does this, when it's not there, it does that, that perfectly explained the data.
Oh, wow. So really was true in that case that the sound law didn't have an exception.
Exactly. And this was sort of seen as the shining achievement of philology as a science. And the people that sort of really held this up, the neo-grammarians in Leipzig and other places, that's who Joseph Wright studied with in Germany That's the kind of comparative philology that he brought back to Oxford, and that's what Tolkien studied. So Tolkien was very much part of that tradition that really focused on the consistency of the sound changes and viewing the whole system of sound as a whole rather than just individual words. And another example in English is something called the great vowel shift, which is a change in all of the long vowels that happened in English in the early modern period. It's why Shakespeare doesn't rhyme for us anymore, or why we get really weird spelling, like the fact that we say the foot with two O's. Foot used to be said fort as just a long version of a single O.
Right.
And feet was fet, but the great vowel shift caused these changes in pronunciation. That's why we say bite rather than bit and so on. But the key thing is these weren't just a change in one word and not in another. This was a systematic change, and one change led to another. There are these things. Grimm's Law and the great vowel shift are examples of what are called chain shifts, because one change causes another, it frees up space for another sound to move into and so on. And so it's all you've got to view language as a system. You can't just talk about these isolated changes. And that's exactly what Tolkien's talking about here, right? He's really focusing on this idea of language as a system and saying that elves understand this. They have an instinctive grasp of the structure and sound system of their speech as a whole.
Whoa. So they're all linguists. They're all philologists.
Well, that's what makes it really interesting. I think that he's, especially in light of the fact that he says that the Eldarin languages are invented languages.
Yeah.
The implication here is that a good language inventor would have their languages exhibit the same properties, right? You can tell
that same consistency and systematic.
Exactly. If your constructed language, your invented language, treats language and sound as a system, then it's actually the way real languages work. Implication, the Eldar are good language inventors, and maybe some other people in the primary world are not so good language inventors. I truly believe Tolkien's having a bit of a dig at
I'm sure he is.
At other people's language invention. The elves knew how to do it. I know how to do it.
Yeah.
Some other people not so much.
Some not so much.
Exactly.
Very sophisticated way of making his point. So Pengoloð continues. He says, "And lo, Elfwine, these changes differ little from like changes that come in the speeches of men with the passing of time. Now, as for the Eldar, we know that such things were done of old by choice, full-wittingly, and the names of those who made new words or first moved great changes are yet often remembered." So maybe here he's like, hey, it would be nice to be remembered for this. Like, we should have our names written down. Anyway, so the kinds of changes that the Eldar made are not dissimilar to the way that human languages change, but they are more deliberate, right? Even to the extent that the Eldar know and credit the people who made the changes. And again, we get that implication that the names of good language inventors might or should go down in history. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Yeah. Pengoloð then goes on to consider why there is order and harmony even in the changes in human language, right? I mean, they're not as good at this as the elves. So why is there order and harmony? Why do their changes also follow rules? Well, there's debate among the loremasters, but Pengoloð basically concludes, well, we can't know for sure. The Eldar just don't understand what goes on in the minds of men. So like, I don't understand why the rats push this button in the maze,
right?
Because they're so far beneath me. I cannot understand their terrible way of thinking. Pengoloð at that point gets into the distinction between living speech, right, the speech of that people use on a day-to-day basis, and that retained for lore. He says, "And to speak of memory, Elfwine, with regard to the elves, for I know not how it is with men, that which we call the chorea quenya, the living speech, is the language wherethrough we think and imagine, for it is to our thought as the body to our spirit, growing and changing together in all the days of our being. Into that language, therefore, we render at once whatsoever we recall out of the past that we heard or said ourselves. If a man remembers something that he said in childhood, doth he recall the accents of childhood that he used in that moment long ago? I know not, but certainly we of the Quendi do not so." So in this paragraph, we get this concept of chorea quenya, the living speech. Pengoloð explains that the Quendi remember the meaning of things that were said and heard as being distinct from the sounds. And he wondered if it was the same for humans. It's really interesting because then he distinguishes that from the role of the older languages. He writes, "For we have much lore concerning the languages of old, whether stored in the mind or in writings. But we hear not ourselves speak again in the past, save with the language that clothes our thought in the present. Verily, it may chance that in the past we spake with strangers in an alien tongue, and remember what was then said, but not the tongue that was used. If the speech were long or the matter subtle, then we clothe it in the living language of our present thought. And if we would now relate it as it was spoken, we must render it anew, as it were a book, into that other tongue, if it is preserved still in learned lore. The koirea quenya, the language of thought, grows and lives within, and each new stage overlies those that went before, as the acorn and the sapling are hidden in the tree." Ooh, another rich analogy.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a footnote in the paragraph where Pengoloð says there's one case in the history of the Eldarin where a former tongue is dropped as the language of living and daily use. That's when the Gondolin exiles took up Sindarin at the suggestion of Thingol, but preserved their old tongue as a language of lore, which of course would be Quenya.
In the concluding paragraphs, Pengoloð winds the discussion up by saying, "Wherefore, Alfwine, if thou wilt consider well all that I have said to thee at this time, not only what is plainly expressed, but also what is therein to be discovered by thought, thou wilt now understand that, albeit more wittingly, albeit more slowly, the tongues of the Quendi change in a manner like to the changes of mortal tongues. Thus, swifter or slower, yet ever inescapably, the far sundered kindreds of the Quendi were sundered also in speech. The Avari from the Eldar, and the Teleri from the other Eldar, and the Sindar who abode in Middle-earth from the Teleri that came at last unto Aman, and the exiles of the Noldor from those that remained in the land of the Valar. And so still it goes in Middle-earth."
Yeah.
The work then ends with the words "Sin quente quel dingoldo elendilenna." So it's appropriate to end with a bit of Quenya here.
Oh, it sure is. I love that.
So interestingly, the "sin quente quendingoldo" means "thus said Pengoloð." Right? So this is another Quenta is spoke. Quendingoldo is Pengoloð's name in Quenya.
Okay.
And what's interesting is this exhibits a common sound change that you can find across all sorts of words, where a QU in Quenya corresponds to a P in Sindarin.
Oh, interesting.
So we see another place that we've already seen that is, remember, we saw before the Quenta Silmarillion, early versions of that were titled the Penas. Penas is just the Sindarin word for Quenta.
Oh.
And one of the sound changes that's gone on there is that the qu sound has become a P.
Huh.
And we see it here. Pengoloð is from Quendingolo. Yeah. And there's also, interestingly, of course, the second part, Elendilenna, to Elendil.
Yeah.
So he's referring to Alfwine as elf friend.
I love that.
And that ending, enna, is an ending that means to. It's what linguists call the allative, to something. Yeah.
We see that in a few. I mean, I'm immediately thinking of like Elendil's oath. Out of the great sea unto Middle Earth I am come, right?
Yes.
And he uses that same ending is there.
Exactly. So ello is the ending when it's from, and enna is the ending when it's to.
Yeah.
So you see that a lot in Quenya.
Yeah, you really do. And I think I remember doing a little bit of word nerdery on that on a Word Nerd Wednesday. But et erello, right? So there's that out of the great sea, and renna utulien.
Yep.
Right? Is to Middle Earth I have come. Oh,
exactly.
Elendilenna. Oh man, that's beautiful.
That's wonderful. And you can see why I love this essay so much. It's
fantastic.
I mean, I would teach this in an introduction to historical linguistics class because it captures so much of what we now understand about language change and the way it
really
works.
Does.
But it also just has this wonderful take on invented languages as well, and how to make them realistic.
And that's the thing. I like how he's saying all these languages, the Eldar, are invented languages. To an extent, isn't that also the case for primary world languages? That they're not all invented by one person. It's not like a person invents English.
I don't know, because he makes it pretty clear, Pengoloð does anyway, that he thinks it's accidental in the case of men.
Okay. Wasn't sure. Yeah, it just sort of happens that way.
Well, and that's sort of the point. The point is that a good language inventor will have that systematicity that you actually get naturally by it happening accidentally.
That makes sense. So this happens already in a sort of chaotic system in nature. And so if you're creating one, it needs to have these same traits, these same characteristics that the one in nature has.
Exactly. Because, and that comes back to the reason that the natural systems develop in a systematic way comes back to that point that he makes about the craft of language invention needing a recipient.
Yes.
Right. You can't just make up things willy-nilly. And so it turns out when you have like a complex adaptive system like language, where you need the recipients to be able to understand what you're saying, that leads to a certain systematicity, because you can't just make a random change here and there. So even though it's accidental, unwitting, I think is one of the terms that Tolkien or Pengoloð uses here, it still results in systematic changes, because that's required for it to be understood by others and adopted by others.
Oh, that is fascinating. Of course, we're not done, folks. We've got some more stuff that Pengoloð teaches, and we'll get to that in a little bit. Folks, if you're enjoying the Prancing Pony podcast, please consider supporting the show by joining the Fellowship of the Podcast. That's what gives me the time and resources that I need to work on making the show the best that it can be. When you join, you become part of an amazing Discord community. It includes live episode recordings, hangouts every month. You also get episode postscripts. You can get an ad-free feed, free merch, and a whole lot more.
You also can become part of our Questions After Nightfall episodes, or even join us as a guest in the North Wing. So please, go to patreon.com/prancingponypod to show your support and join the Fellowship of the Podcast.
And you can always help us out by giving us a rating and review over on Apple Podcasts and a rating on Spotify. And please recommend us to your friends. James, as we get back into it, let's look at the second teaching of Pengoloð.
Yeah, so the other teaching in part 3 of the Peoples of Middle-earth is a single manuscript titled Of Lembas, Mana I Koimas in Eldarin, Maquente Elendil, or What is the Koimas of the Eldar, asked Elendil. Alfwina again being referred to as elf friend here. And I just want to point out Koimas, which we're going to find out is the Quenya word for lembas. Notice that starts with koi, which is the same word that we saw in Koirea Quenya, the living language.
The living.
Yeah, so it's to do with life.
Okay.
Alan, would you like to read this for us?
Yeah, I will. Of lembas. This food the Eldar alone knew how to make. It was made for the comfort of those who had need to go upon a long journey in the wild, or of the hurt whose life was in peril. Only these were permitted to use it. The Eldar did not give it to men, save only to a few whom they loved if they were in great need. This was not done out of greed or jealousy, although at no time in Middle-earth was there great store of this food, but because the Eldar had been commanded to keep this gift in their own power and not to make it common to the dwellers in mortal lands. For it is said that if mortals eat often of this bread, they become weary of their mortality, desiring to abide among the elves and longing for the fields of Aman, to which they cannot come. Okay, I know there's more, but I want to stop there, right?
Yeah. Well, I want to talk about that implication at the end. We'll get into the restrictions about who can use it, but that I find that really fascinating. That if they eat too often of it, they become weary of their mortality and long for Aman.
My first thought is Frodo. Right? My first thought is
exactly.
Frodo having to rely almost exclusively on lembas for those last few days of his journey, and how that's reflected in his no longer feeling at home in Middle-earth.
Yeah.
I mean, that was exactly what that's why I wanted to stop. It's like, wait a minute, Frodo. That is so interesting. Because I mean, we've talked a lot about lembas on the show. We've talked about the letter where Tolkien compares it to viaticum, and the idea that it's this way bread, sort of like communion, that it is, and that I think he even talks about how it's more effective if one's fasting from everything else. Like if it becomes the only thing you eat, it's even more potent. And that certainly seems to suggest what we read here, that it does sort of change a person, a mortal at least. That's interesting. Do you see any other signs of that maybe in Lord of the Rings at all?
Well, I'm trying to think who would have consumed excessive amount.
I mean
Frodo
obviously
Frodo and Sam, yeah. Although the others did.
Yeah, but not often.
Yeah, not often enough. It's interesting that we find out fairly early on we're told it's not out of greed or jealousy.
No.
That it's the elves
They've
are
been
not
told.
Yeah, exactly. Look, there's side effects.
Side effects may include.
Yes, exactly.
If you think lembas is for you, talk to your doctor. Oh man, we can have fun with that one. It also, to some way, explains. I mean, well, there's a whole lot of explanations, but it adds another layer to Gollum's rejection of lembas. Right? I mean, of course he rejected it. It's an elf thing, and he hates the elves.
Right.
But he's clinging on to life.
Yeah.
I mean, just with his fingernails at this point.
Yeah.
So the idea of something that would cause him to become even more weary of his mortality.
Yes.
I don't think that's something he's interested in, let alone longing for the fields of Aman. Oh, I love the fields of Aman. No, songs he never sings for 500, Alex. All right, continuing with of lembas. The Eldar say that they first received this food from the Valar in the beginning of their days in the Great Journey. That meaning the journey from Lake Cuivian and all the way to Valinor. For it was made of a kind of corn. Now I need to break again. Corn does not mean maize. It does not mean the yellow kerneled things. It's
right.
It
Any
can mean any cereal
grain.
It could have been wheat. It could have been barley. It was made of a kind of corn which Yavanna brought forth in the fields of Aman, and some she sent to them by the hand of Orome for their succor upon the long march. Since it came from Yavanna, the queen, or the highest among the elven women of any people, great or small, had the keeping and gift of the lembas, for which reason she was called Masanie, or Besain, the lady or bread giver. And that is fantastic, partly because of the tie into like Lord and Lady in English, and how, it dates back to, the loaf, loaf keeper, the loaf giver. It's fantastic. And in the Silmarillion, we're told, and Christopher quotes this in a footnote here, for according to the customs of the Eldarin, the keeping and giving of lembas belonged to the queen alone. In nothing did Melian show greater favor to Turin than in this gift, for the Eldar had never before allowed men to use this way bread, and seldom did so again. I just got to that point in the story of Turin on today's Tolkien Times, and it is fantastic when you realize that. Beleg's like, hey, I brought this, and Turin's like, no, thanks. keep your bread. And Turin's like, man, you do. Let me just smack you around the head a little bit, because he does in the full version. The Silmarillion version is shortened, but in the full version, Beleg's like, oh, if you don't want anything Elvish, then give back your knowledge, give back your fostering, give back all this stuff. And by the way, this wasn't from Melian. This is from me. She gave it to me. I'm letting you have some. Turin. Oh, man. Turin. Anyway, so the first time the elves get to use it is on that great journey from Cuivian. And like I said earlier, the first time men get to use it is in the Turin story. Now, in Unfinished Tales, the story of how Tuor comes to Gondolin, Voronwë shares some with Tuor on their journey to Gondolin. The only other time I can think of is when it's given to the Fellowship, but I want you to note by whom. Christopher points out the etymology of lady, and indeed Lord, as being related to bread. He says, in using the word lady here, my father no doubt had an eye to its origin in Old English hlaefdia, of which the first element is hlaef, modern English loaf, with changed vowel, and the second a derivative of the stem dig, need, to which dough is ultimately related. Compare with Lord from hlaefweird, bread keeper. I love that. So cool when he makes those real language tie-ins, primary world language tie-ins to the stuff that he does in his own languages.
Exactly. And of course, it makes sense that it's Galadriel that gives them.
Of course. It could only be
lembas,
Galadriel.
because she is, as we're told, the queen or the highest. Well, she's the highest among the elven women of the people.
That group, yeah.
Yes,
she
exactly.
refuses to take the title of queen, but she
Yes.
really is. Let's be honest. Yeah.
The text continues. Now, this corn had in it the strong life of Aman, which it could impart to those who had the need and the right to use the bread.
Now, that's interesting. The right. So if somebody stole it, let's say. It's sort of like the Palantir. If you didn't have the right to use it, you wouldn't be able to use it.
Yeah.
Not effectively.
Yeah, it wouldn't have the strong life of Aman.
Right.
Well,
so
it
would
wouldn't
just be
impart
food.
It wouldn't impart that strong
Right.
life of Aman if you didn't
Right.
have the right to use the bread. Yeah, yeah. It's fascinating, yeah. If it was sown at any season, save in frost, it soon sprouted and grew swiftly, though it did not thrive in the shadow of plants of Middle-earth, and would not endure winds that came out of the north while Morgoth dwelt there.
Wow. Sensitive plant.
Yes. Else it needed only a little sunlight to ripen, for it took swiftly and multiplied all the vigor of any light that fell on it. The Eldar grew it in guarded lands and sunlit glades, and they gathered its great golden ears, each one by hand, and set no blade of metal to it. The white hulm was drawn from the earth, that's the stalk, drawn from the earth in like manner, and woven into corn leaps or baskets for the storing of the grain. No worm or gnawing beast would touch that gleaming straw, and rot and mould and other evils of Middle-earth did not assail it. From the ear to the wafer, none were permitted to handle this grain, save those elven women who were called Yavanildi, or by the Sindar, the Yvonwin, the maidens of Yavanna. And the art of the making of the lembas, which they learned of the Valar, was a secret among them, and so ever has remained. Lembas is the Sindarin name and comes from the older form len mbas, journey bread. In Quenya, it was most often named koimas, which is life bread. So again, we get koi and life, meaning life.
And the moss, which then would correlate to the mbas in the Sindarin.
Yes.
Oh.
And then it ends with Quente Quingoldo,
Which is
thus
quoth
spoke
Pengoloð.
Yes, quoth Pengoloð.
Quoth
Exactly.
Pengoloð.
That marker of the Beleriandic interpolation. In the
I was
Annals
here.
of Eldar. Exactly.
That is fascinating. And as you were reading, there were even more things that jumped to my mind. The idea that one of the things that fuels us, and of course, all plants are fueled by light, but there's such a symbolism in light to begin with in Middle-earth, with the trees, for instance, that this grain takes and multiplies all the vigor of any light that fell on it. It just feels very reflective of the nature and the value of light and the goodness of light.
Yes.
Then just so interesting that they take the stalks and use that as the basket because evil things won't touch it.
Right.
So you're not going to get little creepy crawlies going up the side of the basket because they don't want that stuff. Just interesting. And then of course the lovely story of the Yavanildi, these women that are, this sort of secretive group who, I could give you a recipe for lembas, but you're not going to be able to make it. Right.
I was thinking more I could tell you, but then I'd have to kill you.
I'd have to kill you.
I like your version's probably a little more.
I mean, you won't be able to follow the recipe. It's like just physically not possible.
Exactly.
Oh, but that is so rich. And again, we come back to journey bread, which certainly, I mean, that's no wonder Tolkien called it viaticum. It's the same concept, but boy, just good stuff. And yeah, Quente Quingoldo. I was here.
Yep.
All right. Well, James, before we wrap up, we've got a section we want to talk about here. Why was Pengoloð dropped?
Yeah. For someone that was such a significant part of the way that the story was transmitted. And I think this may start to give us a hint, right? Because he's not crucial to any of the stories.
No, he's not an element in any of the stories themselves.
Only in how we got them.
Yeah.
And so I think what it comes down to is Tolkien continuing to evolve his idea of how we got the stories.
That's true, because we don't read a lot about Elfwine either, for that matter. I mean, we know about Elendil, about Earendil, but it's not the same, even if it's kind of the same.
Yeah. And I suspect that has a lot to do with it. And in fact, Skull and Hammond do say something about this.
Yeah, that's right. I'm going to go ahead and read from that. Yeah. But the existence of the Elvish loremasters made it impossible for the Elvish traditions to be anything but the truth, in quotes. Therefore, Tolkien began to stress even more the part that men played in the transmission of the stories and the inevitable confusion that arose over time. He wrote in a note circa 1958, "The mythology must actually be a mannish affair. The high Eldar living and being tutored by the demiurgic beings must have known, or at least their writers and lore masters must have known, the truth. What we have in the Silmarillion, etc., are traditions, especially personalized and centered upon actors such as Feanor, handed on by men in Númenor and later in Middle-earth, Arnor and Gondor. But already far back from the first association of the Dunedain and elf friends with the Eldar in Beleriand, blended and confused with their own mannish myths and cosmic ideas." Another note says, and by the way, they point out that note is in Morgoth's Ring. They go on and say that another note says that the cosmogonic myths are Númenorian, blending elven lore with human myth and imagination. And in a note to the Shibboleth of Feanor, which was written in 1968 or later, Tolkien added that the Silmarillion is not an Eldarin title or work. It is a compilation, probably made in Númenor, which includes in prose the 4 great tales or lays of the heroes of the Atani, of which the Children of Húrin was probably composed already in Beleriand in the First Age, but necessarily is preceded by an account of Feanor and his making of the Silmarils. All, however, are mannish works, and that's for the peoples of Middle-earth. So as he changes his frame narrative, is like, look, if this is all Elvish, then it's just the truth, and there's no room to say, some say, or to introduce those elements that are interesting and maybe interject some confusion. So we've got to make it a mannish story that combines with Elvish tradition in order to interject this sort of sense of, well, this may not quite be accurate. This might not be a 100% documentary approach to history.
Right. He's wanting...
He wants
because
that.
Yeah, exactly. If they're myths, then they've got to have that element of we don't really know. This has been passed down through many generations.
Think it's so,
yeah, exactly.
And some say, and it might be that.
Right. Which doesn't work if they're elves.
Yeah. If it's a news article written by somebody who was there.
Right.
Who is unbiased and isn't trying... Well, allegedly unbiased. Then all of a sudden you don't have room to turn this into a myth. It just becomes... a retelling of an account.
Memoirs, almost. Right?
Yeah, memoirs.
Yeah.
And that's a lot less interesting than myth.
Yeah. It strikes me also as interesting that the suggestion in that last part that you read is that the Quintus Silmarillion primarily exists to explain the Children of Húrin, the background to the Children of Húrin, which is funnily enough because that's how it started. Right, if you go back, the very first the sketch of the mythology, right, the very first version of the Silmarillion that Tolkien wrote, was to accompany the Children of Húrin to explain the background to it. So it's interesting that it sort of went full circle.
Boy, it sure did, didn't it?
And Tolkien realized for this to work, it's got to be mannish.
Wow.
And therefore it can't be that, and it's got to have come through Númenor. Right? There's this multiple mention of it passing through Númenor and then Gondor. It relates to our whole discussion about the Tale of Years in the Second Age, right? Being very much a Gondorian version of the
focus on making Gondor and in some cases Númenor look better than maybe they actually were.
Yeah. So in light of that, Pengoloð doesn't really have a role to play anymore, which is sad.
It is sad. That's why being a historian is, be in the story, Pengoloð, and then you're actually there. Now nobody knows who you are.
Exactly. That's the message to historians out there.
Yeah.
Make history.
Make history,
don't just write it.
Yeah. All this about Pengoloð being dropped because the mythology must actually be a mannish affair makes me think of the most mannish of men and the mythology that's grown up around him. James? What does Barlaman have in the bag for us tonight? That most mannish of men.
Because when I think of men, I think barley.
Barley. Well,
It's got it in his name. He's Barley Man.
Barley Man. That's right.
That sounds like a superhero. Barley Man. Well, so very appropriate to our conversation that we just had.
Mm-hmm.
Joe from Wisconsin asks, how does Bilbo's translations from the Elvish fit as a source within the frame narrative of Ælfwine?
Oh.
Which throws a whole nother...
It does.
Spanner, wrench, whatever
yeah.
language we're speaking. Language changes. We can put on different clothes, different adornments.
You should say spanner, and then I could say, for our American listeners, you mean wrench.
We've got to dress the thought in different sounds. Exactly. Yeah. So this is a fascinating question that I'm not sure I have the answer to.
I was going to say, if I know I don't. I've always thought that the translations from the Elvish have always intrigued me. Like, what is it that's included in that? You know.
Well, this is sort of what I wonder. Are we correct to assume that that's the source of the Silmarillion, or is that just headcanon?
That's the thing. I think a lot of people, I think it's headcanon, because if Tolkien is saying this needs to be Mannish myth, this needs to come through Numenor and blending Elven lore with human myth, I don't think Bilbo's going to be translating that from Elvish in Rivendell. If he were in Gondor, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe he's translating, from Adunaic, perhaps, if you can find some old texts, translating from that and giving us the Silmarillion. But if he's translating from the Elvish, I'm wondering if he's translating perhaps the original lays, the Elvish lays that tell the stories of all those things, or the lay of Beren and Luthien, or lay of Luthien, I should say.
Yeah.
The lay of the children of Húrin and all of those.
I mean, and if that's the case, I still wonder how we've got a couple of problems here. One is that, of course, the published Silmarillion doesn't tell us at all.
No, right? It doesn't. So
we could only look to what maybe Tolkien was considering later in life, and I can't think of anything other than the sorts of things we just read that was summarized by Skull and Hammond. Yeah. I can't think of anything else where Tolkien. Well, sort of what Tolkien's late thoughts around the transmission was.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think if there's any late mentions of Ælfwine, or is Ælfwine also abandoned? If the Silmarillion had been published with Lord of the Rings.
Yeah. Would it have had a frame narrative, and what would it have been? Because I know Christopher sort of regrets not including a frame narrative in the published Silmarillion. He talks about that.
Right. But he doesn't at all suggest what it would have been from a sort of what the sources were. He talks about it would have been, he likes Sam asking the questions. I'd like to hear more about that. But none of, did it come from...
Yeah. Is it Bilbo's translations from the Elvish, or is it, Ælfwine coming from Pengoloð?
Yeah.
That is interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. What would it have been had Milton Waldman decided, I'm all in, man.
Right.
Give me the Silmarillion and give me the Lord of the Rings. Let's publish it with this other publisher.
Well, I mean, that was the period of time when Tolkien was making that initial combining of Ælfwine and Pengoloð, right? Because it was only in the 1930s that Ælfwine becomes the translator of the works written by Pengoloð the Wise of Gondolin. Prior to that, Pengoloð doesn't get much of a mention.
No.
One thing we didn't talk about is that there's suggestions that maybe Pengoloð was taking on the role that Gilfanon played in the Book of Lost Tales.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't want to get into that here because that's removed from
really does get removed.
from what we're writing. But would Pengoloð have survived so it's all Milton Waldman's fault. It's
1951 that he writes to Milton Waldman. So where was Tolkien in? I mean, you're right, because that's not one of his later. I mean, it's his later thoughts when he realizes that it needs to be a Mannish thing. I mean, that note to the Shibboleth of Fëanor was 1968.
Yeah.
So
it's all post Lord of the Rings.
It is post Lord of the Rings. So, but you wonder if that's something he would have realized as he was then writing, because 1951 he still hasn't written the Lord of the Rings either. He's just got this, outline of a story. Well, he's written most of it.
51 he's written Lord of the Rings. Yeah. He maybe not the appendices. Not
the appendices. That's true. I mean, it's not been published, but he's written.
It's not published. No. Yeah.
No. But he has written most of it.
Yeah.
It's in various stages. I mean, it's not in the final stage that we'd recognize it. That's right. I think what I meant. But of course, I mean, much of it was written when he was sending letters to Christopher Tolkien when he was stationed in South Africa, even prior to that.
In the mid-40s.
mid-40s. So, yeah, I just want to be real clear about that. I didn't mean to imply that he hadn't written it at all. I just it wasn't in a form that you and I would have said, oh, yeah, this is the Lord of the Rings. Yeah, I wonder if, as he did put the finishing touches on it and maybe started to work on the appendices, which, as we've talked about, are very Númenórean and Gondorian focused, would he have changed his mind sooner?
I have to say, and this will tie into, one of the things we're obviously going to talk about in a few weeks is Appendix E. It would not surprise me if, in Tolkien's mind, Appendix E was a Pengoloð.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that would make sense.
Appendix E and F are, I think, very, very... Both of them are very Pengoloð-like. We know that Pengoloð was the one that was going around capturing the history of the languages and everything like that. We know he spent time in Khazad-dûm, where he would have got information about how the dwarves' writing system worked and all that kind of stuff. So I imagine there was at some point where Tolkien would have said that Pengoloð is the source of Appendix E and F.
Of at least the V and F, yeah.
Not I don't think the rest are necessarily of the appendices, but although he still doesn't get a mention.
I know.
It would have been really interesting if...
Poor Pengoloð.
Poor Pengoloð, yes.
Well, folks, poor Pengoloð. That wraps it up for another episode of the Prancing Pony Podcast. Join us next week, though, as we welcome several of our patrons to join us and most likely embarrass us in our 31st Questions After Nightfall episode.
I think we're pretty good at embarrassing ourselves.
I was going to say we do a pretty solid job of that on our own.
Exactly.
We need no help there.
No help, exactly. Although we welcome it if people do want to.
Why not?
Do want to participate, yes.
Of course.
Exactly. Alan and I want to thank the members of Team PPP. Editor Jordan Rennells, Barliman Becca Davis, Social Media Manager Casey Hilsey, Event and Patreon Community Coordinator Katie McKenna, Graphic Artist Megan Collins, and website guru Phil Dean.
And please take a minute to check out theprancingponypodcast.com. You're going to find show notes there, outtakes, Prancing Pony ponderings, as well as our online storefront where you can get PPP merch, featuring all the great episode artwork that Megan's been doing for the show since the start of Season 7.
You'll also want to visit our library page. The Prancing Pony Podcast is, after all, a podcast about the books. So if you're interested in a book we've mentioned on the show, you'll find a link for it in our library. We do get a small amount of compensation when you make your purchase, and we thank you for that.
Indeed, we do. We also want to thank our patrons at the Kierdans contribution tier. I'll start with DeMay in Alaska, Chad in Texas, Lance in New Jersey, Joseph in Michigan, Kathy from North Carolina, Carlos in California, Brian in the UK, Jerry from Washington, Joe in Washington, Erwin from the Netherlands, Ben in Minnesota, Anthony in Texas, Zaksu in Illinois, Sarah in New Jersey, Joshua in Massachusetts, Lucy in Texas, Keith in Alabama, Erica in Texas, and Vivian in California.
There's also James in Massachusetts, Anne in Kentucky, Sean in New Jersey, Mason in California, Maureen from Massachusetts, Olivia in London, Robert in Arizona, Nick in Wisconsin, Lewis in South Carolina, Thomas in Germany, Craig in California, Bailey in Texas, Kevin in Massachusetts, Julie in Washington, Bruce in California, Joe in Maryland, Nathan in Arizona, and Kevin in Pennsylvania. Thank you all so very much for your support.
Indeed, thank you very much.
Now make sure you don't miss any episodes of the Prancing Pony Podcast. Subscribe now through Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, or your favorite podcast app.
And one last thing, as always, don't forget to send your thoughts, comments, and most of all, how you'd restore Pengoloð to his deserved place in history to Barliman at theprancingponypodcast.com.
And if you want your voice literally heard, well, just send us audio of your question. Visit podinbox.com/prancingponypod and record your question for us. Be sure to still email the question to Barliman, though.
Now, even though Barliman's been a lot more reliable lately, there is still a lot of mail to sort through. We'll try to get to you just as soon as we're able. As always, though, this has been far too short a time to spend among such excellent and admirable listeners and with an absolutely poor, tragic historian who's disappeared. But until next time,
may you rekindle hearts in a world that grows chill.